Hi there, I'm June Hogan. I'm a career coach and founder of outplacement services provider Wildwood Coaching. And this is a recording of a free monthly lunch and learn session that I run with my colleague Robin, each month diving into a different aspect of managing redundancies. This month, we're talking about redundancy frequently asked questions. So we talk about things like what's a suitable alternative role, what's a trial period, what happens to commission, bonus, and benefits in the event of redundancy, and other things besides. So these sessions are completely free, and if you'd like to join us live in the future, there's a link to do that in the show notes. I hope you find the session helpful, and if you've got any queries, questions, or comments, we would always love to hear from you. So this is a session all around redundancy FAQs. And so we've got a couple just to start us off here, Robin. We've done this session before, haven't we? And these kind of come up, and these may have come up in your experience as well, for those of you who've managed redundancies before. So let's just talk about those two, because I guess, first of all, it depends whether the individual is in scope in the first place, and also what might you do with someone who finds a job before their redundancy date. I work with individuals who that may have happened to them when they're sort of accessing outplacement support, and they may be lucky enough to find a job before they actually leave. So talk us through those two then, Robin, and how you might approach both of them.
Yeah, so it does happen on a reasonably regular basis where people have resigned before any announcement is made, etc. The employer has the ability, if they so wish to do so, to, with mutual consent with the individual, to rescind their resignation and then put them through the redundancy process, if they so wish to do so. However, there's no legal requirement to do so. So if someone has resigned, a week before any announcements, then you can treat that as a pure resignation and there is no redundancy. So the factors to think through are, what's fair and reasonable to the employer, what is financially the consequences of doing that. So it's a case by case basis. But if you do it for one, then just think through that you may have to do it for other people as well. And then you need to look at the financial impact before making a confirmed decision either way, in whichever way you land. But there's no right or wrong answer to that question. In terms of if you have started the redundancy consultation process, especially on the individual side, what happens if they find another job? Well, the legislation is a little bit grey on that particular point, but the onus, not the onus, but the moral decision is very much along the lines of, if people find another job and it's more than likely that they are going to be confirmed as redundant, then you should be, reasonably take the high ground. And if they can go early, i.e., you need to look at your business operation, can you afford for them to leave? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it a month before the actual termination date? You need to take those kind of points into your thinking process. But where I've done it, I've always looked at all the facts to that particular individual. And if you're going to be paying PILON anyway, then actually you just bring forward the termination date. You allow them to have the, be it enhanced or the statutory, and you confirm those details with the individual. So I'm always of the opinion, if you can help people, and I'm putting my HR hat on, into finding other work, then you should try and support them as much as you possibly can. But there will be instances where you won't want person A to leave up until maybe the very end of the operation, because you need them in place still. So it's a balancing act again. So again, there's no right or wrong answer, but you need to take all the kind of elements into consideration.
And I guess that's something that when you're doing the consultations and you're talking to people about that kind of thing, that you might want to talk about in terms of come and talk to us if this happens. I remember working with an organisation and they wanted people to work their notice because they were restructuring, and they wanted individuals to work for 3 months. And this one individual found a job really, really quickly and had told the employer that they were available immediately, and it all got a little bit difficult. I wasn't involved because I was doing the outplacement, but essentially that individual probably should have said, I'm available from 2 months' time, whatever, and it might not have got quite so difficult, but they needed them to stay for legitimate reasons. But I agree, the ultimate aim is to help somebody move forward in all of this, and to
Yeah.
be flexible where possible.
I also think sometimes from an HR perspective, you need to have that honest conversation with individuals as early as possible in terms of the if their new employer is saying you start on this date or don't bother starting again, is that really an employer you want to go and work with? So
Mm.
there are nuances within the whole kind of spectrum of that scenario. Now, I've also been where the new employer has turned around and said, we want you to start literally tomorrow, and we will pay you as a golden hello what you would have got in a redundancy package. So, it depends on, but there's so many different angles that it can go down.
Yeah.
But it's really just sit down with the individual, have a discussion, and where you can be reasonable to allow them to go early, then I would always support that.
And also, I guess, think about the impact, like you said, when you were talking about the first point, think about the impact if you allow one person to do that, then, what might that look like? But ultimately, I think this is all about being reasonable, isn't it? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
these are
So there was
some, sorry, Robin.
one other point is, of course, if you've signed a settlement agreement, I let's say there's an enhanced package, then you can only mutually change the date of termination if both parties agree.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some here around sort of the technicalities, I guess. So PILON, we use that term, don't we? And I think we use it in HR a lot. But what does that actually mean, and how does it work? And then these might be questions that might come up from individuals, and I guess you've seen these over the years as well. Why might somebody have to work their notice and not get paid? As I say, there's the option, isn't there, that employers can generally use. Things like what happens to benefits, company cars, etc. And also, I think this is one sometimes, again, I normally work with people sort of towards when they're leaving or after they've left. But when will my employment actually end? I think some people kind of, they need to know these things, that they just start planning. So just talk us through some of these, particularly PILON. So when can you use it? What does it mean? How does it work?
yeah, so I mean, normally for paying leave notice, it will be normally stipulated in your employment contracts. I'd always suggest that if it's not, then you need to review your employment contracts. Um, and there's various good reasons for an employer saying, actually, we're happy to pay your notice and you leave on the termination date, because there is sometimes when you're going through a redundancy process, it can be quite painful, not only for the employee, but also the employer, if you've got demotivated individuals for that, be it 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. It can, really vary. And, some individuals won't be motivated to work past the proposed termination date, while others actually will want to work all the way through. I think it's more common these days for companies to do PILON rather than making people work their notice. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. And also, there's financial implications of doing that, because if you pay PILON, then let's assume that it's 3 months. Then for those 3 months, you're not the company isn't getting anything back. But I think from my experience, I think doing PILON tends to work better for all parties, but it depends on the organization.
Mm. And I find
Um,
as well, sometimes it can depend on the individual. So some individuals that I've worked with have wanted to carry on with like the stability and the regularity of work and to work through their notice, because for some of them that work is the thing that holds them together, and that's the main thing that they have going on in their lives for whatever reason. And yes, clearly operationally you need to make a decision on that. But there might be some people that if it's practical that could request to work, and you might want some people to be available and doing some of that work. So I think it can depend on individuals as well. But if you're doing a large program, clearly you're going to have to make these decisions up front, aren't you?
yes, and when do individuals tend to say, I want to work my notice, I don't want it to be paid, and that's always an interesting discussion. And it could be well, I just want to finish this project and leave it in a good state of affairs.
Yeah.
So the honourable side. You then have people who perhaps are midway through some kind of medical procedure and they're covered by, the company's healthcare insurance. So actually for them, it may be advisable to stay on and work their notice, even though they might not actually be at work, but they would still be classed as employed and still be entitled to the Bupa or Vitality healthcare scheme and treatment that goes along with that. So, there's reasons why people want to stay on. Sometimes there's definitely employers might think, actually, we want you to work your notice because of financial implications. But also it could be that actually we don't want you slipping off to our competitor who's just down the road, and we're going to make you work your notice. So at least we've got, that 3 month kind of window to, look at the operational side and, link you to your restrictive covenants, etc., because you're still an employee.
And would you use garden leave in that situation potentially?
Yeah, I mean, garden leave is they're still employed, so they are technically working their notice during that garden leave. And yet it could be garden leave, you need to explain to individuals what that means in terms of, yes, we want you to stay at home. However, we want you to be available as and when requested. If you want to take holiday during that time, you can do in a normal manner. It needs to, be authorized. But if we want you in the office to do a particular task, then you have to come into the office to do that particular task. But you need to put those boundaries, make sure that the individual understands what garden leave actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So in terms of benefits then, I mean, you've alluded to, the healthcare benefits, for example, company car, all these things, and these aren't going to apply to everyone necessarily, things like pension contributions. And obviously bonus and commission will depend on your policy around that as well. But in general terms, how does this work in the event of a redundancy?
Yeah, so I mean, when I'm doing PILON calculations, I change the terminology a little bit, called PILON, which is pay in lieu of benefits. So it's PILON plus benefits. Now it depends on what's written into your contract of employment. Some of them will expressly say this only includes your base pay, for example. But technically, PILOB should include all your benefits, and you almost have to do that calculation in terms of, what is from your contractual benefits, what is the cash value of those benefits? So, be it your medical, be it your life assurance, which a lot of people forget to use in the calculations, and you almost kind of put it back into a weekly amount of what that cash for having the life assurance would be. So, £7.50 a week. Guess what? If they've got, 12 weeks notice, then it's, 12 times that amount, and you just add it on to that pylon calculation. So, there's company cars, there's first aid kind of payments, fire marshals. Sometimes there's other benefits that they may have. Pension contributions, which is the next question down, is only the employer contributions that you may have to pay. Bonus commission is more of a tricky one. It depends if it's contractual or discretionary, and it will come down to how generous the employer wants to be, or how difficult it is to calculate. And when are the time frames? I mean, ideally, in any bonus or commission scheme, you should outline exactly what it means, what the criteria for payment is, and to a certain extent, you should also put in there, what happens at in termination situations. You know, and there's different reasons for termination, isn't there? If it's a resignation, would you want to pay out bonus and commission? Maybe, maybe not. If it's redundancy, then you might be a little bit more generous. And there's other reasons for dismissal. if it's gross misconduct, are you still going to pay a bonus or commission? It depends, but let's say it's non-contractual, the answer is probably not. If it's something else, i.e. redundancy, then you might be a little bit more generous. But it's actually quite important to kind of list out in your bonus schemes, which, some businesses are, very, very good at in pulling through what should be in there, while other organisations, unfortunately, it's very open to interpretation.
Yes, I, for my sins, spent some time working in reward back in my corporate career. And so the policy would have what was a good leaver, what was a bad leaver, what would you do in this, what is determined as a good leaver. Generally, redundancy was classed as a good leaver. Things like misconduct were classed as a bad leaver. And then what would you do in those kind of situations? And people generally used to resign after bonuses were paid. So people don't generally resign just before the payment. But anyway, these things happen. So I saw something pop up in the chat. Did you grab that, Robin? I didn't see it.
Yeah, so PILON should include benefits, bonuses, etc. Yes, if they are contractual, then they should all be included. However, if it's discretionary bonuses and it's not necessarily custom and practice, etc., then bonuses wouldn't necessarily automatically be included in a PILOB calculation. So there's no straight answer. You need to go and look through the documentation. In the employment contracts, first of all, review what's contractual, what's non-contractual, and then you can make a decision on should it be included or not. If you want to include more beyond what is contractually, due, then you can do by all means. And it's not uncommon for those discussions to take place during collective consultation in terms of, well, what's included in that calculation, Robin? This is what we put down, and then it's what about this and what about this, and then it's like let's have a look at the documentation to see where that takes us. But the more generous you are during collective consultation to get something over the line, then that can sometimes benefit the business in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, well, I guess if you're planning, or you think that redundancies are on the horizon, or if it's just good practice, you might just want to go back and review some of these policies and get things kind of tidied up before this kind of stuff kind of happens. And yeah, and then this point about when will my employment end? So again, depends if you're an individual, collective, how many people, timing, etc. But I think it's a helpful one for people to sort of understand from an FAQs perspective, in terms of, yes, it's all subject to consultation, but fundamentally, how would you explain that to somebody if they're sort of, you're early in consultation and, well, when am I actually going to leave if in the event my role is made redundant?
Yeah, so I mean, in collective consultation, I would normally put a proposed time line together, and in that I'd put, a proposed last day of employment. Now, you may have in certain situations, you may have some people with different dates, for example, because you can let those people go, but you need to hang on to these people for another month to do, the closure of a site or administration tasks or whatever it might be. So, it's always proposed during kind of collective consultation. Obviously, if you're using settlement agreements, then it will dictate in the exact termination date. Otherwise, it's very much along when you get into the individual consultation, it's the initial meeting is, hey, the proposed redundancy is on this date, and you go through how do we mitigate and all those kind of elements, and make it clear that if we are unable to mitigate, then your likely termination date will be X. And then obviously on the final consultation, individual consultation meeting, you would actually confirm when the redundancy is. And that might be it's tomorrow, and we're paying PILON, or it's the if you're making them work their notice, it's this will be your last day of employment, and you are confirmed as redundant, and you will work your notice up until your last day of employment, which is X, and that will be in the final letter that you would provide to the employee.
And for those people that are working their notice, I know we talked about this before, if there is suitable alternative employment that comes up during that time and all that kind of thing, which is again a possibility, then you would have to then go back and have another meeting to confirm all of that.
Yeah, and it's a good thing we probably missed off earlier on actually is, why do some individuals say I want to work my notice? If it's a big multinational organization, then it might be that they want to stay for as long as possible to maximize their ability to apply for other suitable roles within the business. So that is an advantage to the employee, but also to the employer if, during those 3 months or whatever their notice period is, that you've actually got that additional time to try and find them other roles. Obviously, it depends on the scenario. If the whole business is closing down, then there's unlikely to be any suitable alternative employment. Whereas if it's a very large organization, there may be other roles that you don't know about yet, but actually in 6 weeks' time, halfway through their notice period that they're working, that may change. And obviously, you can go back to the individual. Kind of say, "Hey, congratulations, we've found you a suitable alternative employment." The individual might kind of say, "I don't think it is a suitable alternative," and you have that discussion with them. And obviously, the company can make the decision that they believe it is suitable alternative employment, and therefore no redundancy exists at this point in time. So therefore, we confirm that you are not at risk of redundancy. Or vice versa, an individual says, this is a suitable alternative, and that's great, and they're successful in any recruitment application process, and then obviously they get the statutory trial period if it's deemed a suitable alternative, and obviously that needs to be done in writing. You can kind of rescind their current redundancy risk scenario, and then obviously you need to follow up during that month to make sure that has additional training been given, and have those checkpoints quite early on in that 4 week mini probation, which is what it turns out to be. And it's not wait until the 4 weeks and the individual says, actually I want my original redundancy, which is calculated on the original termination date of when their original role came to an end. It's you need to build in probably at least a weekly meeting with that individual to make sure that all parties are agreed that it is suitable alternative employment or not, as the case may be.
And that comes on to one of the FAQs we've got in a minute, but it just reminds me, we did a session on that, didn't we? Where we went into quite a lot of detail. So maybe we'll dust that one off, because suitable alternative employment is something that needs to be properly structured, like you said, Robin. So this kind of relates there. You've talked a little bit about the trial period, for how long. Technically, you've got that month, haven't you? Reasonable time off to look for work. This is something that, when I work with individuals, they'll often say to me, "Well, I'm not really sure what that means." And clearly, I will say, "Well, go and talk to your line manager, go and talk to your HR manager, get some clarification on what that is." If you're generally talking about what does reasonable time off mean, how would you frame that, and what are the kind of legal requirements?
Yeah, as lovely employment legislation always says, reasonable. It doesn't actually dictate or expressly say it's X amount of hours per week or whatever. So it's always a difficult one to write down, apart from say we will provide reasonable time off for things like interviews, but you need to go via your line manager. So if an individual kind of says, "Oh, I've got an interview, I want to take 3 days off so I can prepare," then I'd question, is that reasonable or not? And I'd go back to say, well, perhaps it's there's some compromise in the middle, that we allow you the day of the interview to have time off. However, the 3 days is may be deemed unreasonable. The other one that used to be common, years ago, was probably I want to go round, face to face and go and sign up to 30 different recruitment agencies and spend the next 3 weeks not in work but going to recruitment agencies. That would probably be deemed as unreasonable in my opinion. However, nowadays it is very much online, isn't it? In
Mm.
terms of looking for work, and it may be you requested, you know, maybe a couple of days off to go along to recruitment agencies. What we propose is actually we can give you, an hour a day, using the work laptop to be able to sign up to the recruitment boards, for example. But there's no right or wrong answer. You just got to be reasonable. Who judges what reasonable is? It comes down to the absolute end game is an employment tribunal chairman, but you don't want to be going down that pathway. So, where you can give people time off, I'd say if it was an interview, I would say yes, absolutely. In terms of how much time does someone need for an hour interview, if it's a 2 hour drive away and a 2 hour drive back and it's an hour interview, well, that's pretty much a day. If it's, 5 minutes from the office and, that might be, yeah, we can give you a couple of hours off. That's not a problem at all.
Mm.
I, yeah.
And I think that point about access to a computer or a laptop or something at work, particularly for colleagues in operational roles, manufacturing roles, I guess we assume that everyone's got access to this kind of technology. And certainly when I've worked, particularly with individuals working in manufacturing organizations, some of them will be trying to do all of this on their phone, which is incredibly difficult to try and update your CV on a phone or to apply for roles. So I think that's an important one as well, about recognizing that not everyone's got access to this kind of technology, and just to be sympathetic to that and provide facilities, which, as you say, can be classed as reasonable time off because you're giving them some time off the job to come and do that. So we talked about the trial period, but in terms of a suitable alternative, and again, we've gone into detail on this in another session, and we can do that in the future. The requirements for a suitable alternative role. So what are the general stipulations on that, Robin?
Yeah, so there's some criteria in the legislation that outlines it. So, it's got to be of equal value. That doesn't mean to say that it has to pay exactly the same, but it's got to be in the rough ballpark. So if you've got a person who's paid, £100,000 and you're offering them a role that's only at £50,000, then it's probably not equal value. So it would fall down on that criteria. Whereas if they were earning £100,000 and there was a different role which was at 90,000, well, actually 10% is probably within the realms of reasonableness. So that's one factor, equal value. The second one is equal status, which is an interesting use of terminology. But the example I always kind of give is, hey, if you've got a managing director and you offer him a cleaning role, then actually, do you know what? It hasn't got the same status. So even if you kept the salary the same, it wouldn't hit that criteria. So status is a very, I'd say, subjective kind of element of the suitable alternative employment equation. But yeah, you have to be mindful of, well, if I'm doing a multinational role and then I'm only going to be given a one country role, is that the same status? Was I on the board as a senior leadership team member and now I'm not going to be? So again, you need to review all those elements. Probably, a good idea is doing some kind of form of job comparison on the job roles and seeing and doing that exercise. And, if it's around ballpark figure of, I don't know, 70, 75% similar, then I think, the employer could say that it is suitable alternative employment. And likewise, if an individual could make the same kind of analysis as well and say, well, actually, I think, it's probably 80% of what I already do. And with a little bit of training, I think I can get from here to there. Then again, it could fall within those brackets of suitable alternative employment. And then there's the typical employment law get out clause, which is and anything else. And things that come into that bucket could be things like location.
Mm.
So, if someone is employed in sunny Solihull and they suddenly say, hey, there's suitable alternative employment up in Edinburgh or Newcastle, then actually is that reasonable? I would probably suggest it could be for some individuals, but probably 95% of the time it's probably going to be unreasonable. So you'd need to kind of think around, and that works both ways, doesn't it? So some individual might say, actually, I'm absolutely fine to move to Newcastle from Solihull. I've got relatives up that way, and actually, I was thinking of moving back north. So for me, that works. In terms of further discussions on will the employer pay for relocation expenses and things like that, well, again, that's a decision for the company to reflect on in terms of do they want to keep the skills within the business, or actually do they have other views on that, and or can they afford it? But it depends on the package, on the redundancy and the skills and the direction the business is going. So as I keep saying in these forums, there's never a right or wrong answer. You need to look at all the individual circumstances to be able to make that determination.
And you might find someone, as you say, who's happy to take a reduction in salary, take a reduction in status, and move location because it suits them to remain employed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't fall within the realms of suitable alternative employment, then there wouldn't necessarily be a requirement for the statutory 4-week trial period. If it's a totally different role, so if it's an HR bod who suddenly is being offered they've had a previous finance background, let's say, and they say, actually, I don't want to do HR anymore. I understand my role is being made redundant. However, that finance role over there, and it could be a different location, substantially lower salary, then it wouldn't be determined that was suitable alternative employment. So they wouldn't necessarily get the 4-week trial period, and they would accept that role as starting a new role, like anything else. So it might get them out of the redundancy kind of a scenario, but then they wouldn't necessarily be able to fall back 4 weeks later and say it's not suitable and I don't want to do it anymore and I want my redundancy. That boat has already sailed.
Yeah, no, that's a good point actually. So, and I guess making people aware of that in that situation, that's what's going to happen. So, wonderful.
Yeah.
So we've just got a few more questions, and then if there are any more from anyone else, now I think this is an interesting one. When people say, "Well, why aren't you offering VR?" And then these are the two around the meeting themselves. So when you get that challenge or that question, Robin, I mean, again, there's so much that it can depend on, but what would you generally advise people in that situation?
It will come down to many different factors. Why would a company want to offer a voluntary redundancy process? It may be that to make the process quicker for all parties. It's not uncommon for employee reps to say, we want this process done as quickly as possible so people know what the final outcome is going to be. And therefore, if you go down a VR process, we can do that quicker, because if someone accepts a voluntary redundancy package, then typically in there say we will pay you X and you leave on Y date. So that offer has been accepted, then it's kind of binding on both parties. So that the quickness is one element. The other rationale from an HR perspective is that by offering voluntary redundancy, then typically you wouldn't then enter into individual consultation. So if you're doing a big collective process, then if someone has said, yes, I want to take VR, accepted the package, you wouldn't then necessarily need to go down the individual consultation period. So from an HR perspective, that can save time for all parties already. In terms of, obviously you don't have to, the statutory minimum for redundancy is what it is, and then has been for many years in terms of the formula. Although I think that some other countries do it in a better way than we do, but let's not go there. Um, but yeah, and if an employer can afford to, give an ex gratia payment, then and look after employees who are going through a difficult time. Yes, some people will get jobs, literally 5 minutes after they've left the current employer, whereas some other individuals, it might take them, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Every individual is different. So the more that you can give them a soft landing, then, if you can afford it, then hey, that's great for, those individuals. But, there's no requirement to offer voluntary redundancy. However, in the ACAS documentation, it does actually suggest that to mitigate against compulsory redundancies, employers should consider voluntary redundancy. But that's all it says.
And for anyone that wasn't with us last month, there we did a deep dive into voluntary redundancy, and that's on the YouTube channel as well if you want to check out that recording. And then just these last two then, Robin. So I'm always an advocate of allowing someone to bring someone into a redundancy meeting with them. I was placed at risk of redundancy. I'd worked in HR, thought I knew the drill, went in there on my own, and I didn't hear anything after they said your role is at risk of redundancy. I mean, it was it was all just a blur. So for someone who's never been in that situation, it can be, quite overwhelming. And I wished I'd had someone with me. So, I mean, I know legally there are certain meetings that you can bring someone with you. But what's your advice in general around bringing people to redundancy consultation meetings?
Well, my advice from the employer's perspective is very much along the lines of, hey, there's a legal obligation to allow a work colleague or trade union official to be with the person who's at risk of redundancy during their individual consultation. So that's a minimum requirement, and that's where I would kind of tend to start. Do you sometimes get the request of, can I bring my mother, father, can I bring my best mate who's a barrister into the individual consultation meetings? I think my first response is probably to say, thank you, but no, unless there is some rationale for that individual being there, normally from a disability perspective. So, if someone has a medical mental health issue, then it may be appropriate to have some more kind of support. If they're hard of hearing, you might want an interpreter. If their English isn't their second language, you might want an interpreter. But generally, those are the only kind of real rationales that I've allowed someone else to participate. Generally, I have on occasion, on a rare occasion, allowed, especially when it's been an apprentice, to have a parent with them, but that's by exception. And the rationale for that is because they are young and new to work and may not understand the implications of a individual redundancy consultation meeting. But that's really the limited by exception. So I will consider it, but normally my answer is no.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it matters to the individual to have somebody with them, but clearly it has to be an appropriate person. And then I guess, lots of times these meetings are going to be online, if you've got a remote organization, or even in person. I guess people bring their phone and want to stick it on record. What do you say in those situations?
So from me personally, there's no legal right to record the meetings. Notes are to be taken and provided afterwards, but actually recording on an electronic device, there's no obligation from the employer to say yes to. You're absolutely right. More and more of redundancy consultation meetings are done online. And it's not always the employer saying we'll do them online. It's actually the individuals requesting, when they're given the option of, do you want it face to face or do you want it, over Teams or Zoom or whatever it might be. I think that generally the last few years, people have kind of said, actually, I don't want to come into the office. I want it to be done via Teams. And when I'm asked the question of, can I record it? I'm like, absolutely yes, because I put on the automatic note taker and I can concentrate more on the meeting rather than trying to scribble down all the what's being said to the individuals. So I think it's a good thing. From my perspective, I'm quite comfortable. You do have to be a little bit more astute into what you're actually saying because it will be word for word, whatever you say, the employee will see that as you agreed it. So you need to be, really mindful what you're saying. And obviously, if things start to get out of hand, then you may need to kind of pause the meeting, or if tempers start to flare, then it is being recorded. So you need to think through what you're saying, but also from the individual's perspective, you don't want them getting into any more trouble than any kind of disciplinary action because of them swearing or whatever. So, those kind of elements. But generally, I'm quite comfortable for meetings to be recorded. If it is face to face and they walk in with their iPhone and the red light is on and they say, "Can I record?" I'd say yes, but I'd like a copy of it. Um, if individuals record it without your knowledge and then later on say, I recorded it, review what you want to do at the time. Secret recording might come under your disciplinary policy. So, but I personally, I'm not worried because I do everything correct the first time round, and I'm not going to say anything that I shouldn't have said in any meeting, be it recorded or not.
Yeah, and I guess that can give people a level of comfort as well, can't it? Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin. We do these every month. Robin and I get together on different topics. You can listen to my podcast, which goes into lots of detail on supporting people through redundancy. And there's also blogs, and you can find details about outplacement if you're interested in offering that to people. And also, Robin has lots of expertise in this area. It's available for consultancy or just for someone to just pick up the phone and have a chat. So you'll find him on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. And the small print there, which is very small, but I'm sure you can appreciate that we're not here to give legal advice, and we're just here to give you some guidance. And that next time we're meeting on the 16th of June, and we're going to be talking about best practice for individual consultation meetings. So you're likely to get an email if you've joined today's session via my email list. You'll get an email with that. You can sign up. And as ever, if you can't make the session live, there'll be a recording available as well. So if anyone has any questions, we're happy just to hang around for a few minutes and answer them. And hopefully that's been a useful insight into some of the questions that can come up. But we've been running these now for, I think it's almost 2 years, Robin. So redundancy is a complex and in-depth process. So we weren't going to get across everything in an hour, but that's just a bit of a taste